September 1945. The war in Europe had ended 4 months ago. The Pacific Theater had fallen silent just weeks before. America was breathing again, but not everyone could exhale. In the small town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, some families were still waiting for sons who would never come home, waiting for answers that might never arrive. Eleanor Hartwell was one of those mothers. The autumn leaves had begun their slow descent from the oak trees lining Maple Street, painting the sidewalks in shades of amber and rust. Eleanor stood at her kitchen window, her hands submerged in warm, soapy water as she washed the breakfast dishes. The radio played softly in the background Glenn Miller's orchestra, a bittersweet reminder of better days. She was 52 years old, but the war had aged her. Silver threads wove through her once dark hair, and deep lines had etched themselves around her eyes, not from laughter, but from tears shed in the quiet hours of the night when no one was watching. Her son, Private First Class Thomas Hartwell, had been missing in action since December 1944. 9 months of silence. 9 months of checking the mailbox with trembling hands. 9 months of jumping at every knock on the door, hoping for news, dreading confirmation. Knock, knock, knock. Eleanor's hands froze in the dishwater. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Not again. Please, God, not again. She dried her hands slowly on her apron, buying herself a few more seconds of not knowing. The walk from the kitchen to the front door felt like miles. Through the lace curtain, she could see a silhouette, not the Western Union messenger she feared, but a postal worker in his familiar brown uniform. She opened the door. "Morning, Mrs. Hartwell," said Frank Morrison, the mailman who'd been delivering to Maple Street for 20 years. His usual cheerful demeanor was subdued today. In his hands, he held a small package, wrapped in brown paper and tied with rough twine. "Got something for you. Needs a signature." Eleanor's eyes fixed on the package. It was no bigger than a shoebox, weathered and marked with postal stamps she couldn't quite make out. Her hand trembled as she signed the clipboard. "You all right, Mrs. Hartwell?" Frank asked, concern creasing his weathered face. "I don't know yet," she whispered, taking the package. It was heavier than she expected. Frank tipped his cap and descended the porch steps, leaving Eleanor alone with the mysterious box. She closed the door and walked to the living room, where a framed photograph of Thomas in his uniform sat on the mantel. He was smiling in the picture, young, confident, ready to serve his country. He'd been just 23 years old when he shipped out. Eleanor sat in her late husband's armchair, the package resting on her lap. Her fingers traced the address label. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell. 428 Maple Street. Millbrook, Pennsylvania. There was no return address. Just a single notation in the corner, written in unfamiliar handwriting, from a friend of your son. With shaking hands, she untied the twine and carefully peeled back the brown paper. Inside was a simple wooden box, the kind soldiers sometimes carved in their spare time. The lid bore a roughly etched design, 2 crossed rifles beneath an oak tree. Eleanor lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in a bed of faded olive fabric that looked like it had been cut from a military uniform, were several items: a stack of letters tied with string, a tarnished dog tag that wasn't Thomas's, a small black and white photograph of 3 young soldiers with their arms around each other's shoulders, and a folded piece of paper that looked newer than the rest. She picked up the folded paper first. Her hands trembled as she opened it. "Dear Mrs. Hartwell. My name is Corporal Vincent Castellano. You don't know me, but I knew your son. I served with Thomas in the 101st Airborne Division. We jumped together into Normandy, fought together through France, and froze together in Bastogne. I'm writing this letter because I made your son a promise, and I aim to keep it. Thomas was my best friend, ma'am. He was the bravest man I ever knew, and he saved my life more times than I can count. What's in this box? These are things Thomas wanted you to have if he didn't make it home. But there's more to the story than what the army told you. Your son isn't missing in action, Mrs. Hartwell. He's gone. He died on December 19, 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, outside a small Belgian town called Bastogne. But he didn't die the way you might think. And before I come to see you in person, and I will come, I promise, I wanted you to have these pieces of him. The letters will explain everything. Read them in order. They're numbered on the back. Thomas talked about you every single day. He loved you more than life itself, ma'am. And what he did in those final hours, it's something you need to know about. Something the whole world needs to know about. I'll be in Millbrook within the week. There are things I need to tell you face to face. Things about your son that will break your heart and make you proud in the same breath. Until then, know that Thomas Hartwell was a hero. Not because of how he died, but because of how he lived. With deepest respect. Corporal Vincent Castellano. Eleanor's tears fell onto the letter, smudging the ink. Her hands clutched the paper to her chest as a sob escaped her throat, a sound of anguish and relief twisted together. Her boy was gone. After 9 months of hoping, the truth had finally arrived. But this Corporal Castellano, this stranger, said there was more to the story. Eleanor looked down at the stack of letters in the box. 7 envelopes, each numbered on the back in Thomas's familiar handwriting. She picked up the first one, her fingers trembling. The envelope was creased and stained, as if it had been carried in a pocket for months. She slid out the letter inside and began to read her son's words, words written from foxholes and bombed-out buildings, words written in the shadow of death. June 7, 1944. Somewhere in Normandy, France. Dear Mom. I'm alive. I know that's what you need to hear first, so I'll say it again, I'm alive. Yesterday was the longest day of my life. We jumped into France in the middle of the night, scattered across the countryside like seeds in the wind. I lost my equipment, couldn't find my unit for 6 hours, and spent most of D-Day trying not to get killed. But I met someone yesterday who's going to change everything. His name is Vincent Castellano, we call him Vinny. He's from Brooklyn, talks a mile a minute, and has a smart remark for everything. We found each other in a ditch while German bullets were tearing up the hedgerow above us. He looked at me and said, "Hey pal, you got any idea where we are?" I said, "France, I think." And he laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Well, that's a start." Mom, I thought I was going to die yesterday. I really did. But somehow, when I was with Vinny, the fear felt smaller. Like as long as we stuck together, we might actually make it through this thing. We made a pact last night, sitting in that foxhole. We promised each other that no matter what happens, if one of us makes it home and the other doesn't, we'll look after each other's families. We'll tell the truth about what happened over here. We'll make sure the ones we love know we didn't die for nothing. I don't know what's coming next, Mom. But I know I'm not alone anymore. And that makes all the difference. Tell Mrs. Patterson her apple pie recipe is the only thing getting me through this. I dream about it every night. I love you. Tommy. Eleanor pressed the letter to her lips, tasting salt from her tears. She could hear Thomas's voice in every word, his humor, his hope, his fear barely concealed beneath bravado. She reached for the second letter, but a knock at the door stopped her. This time, it was heavier. More insistent. Eleanor set the letters down carefully and walked to the door, her heart pounding. Through the window, she could see a tall figure in a worn army jacket, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He was too thin, with dark circles under his eyes and a posture that spoke of exhaustion bone deep. She opened the door. "Mrs. Hartwell," the young man said, his voice rough. "My name is Vincent Castellano. I served with your son." Eleanor looked into the stranger's eyes and saw grief mirrored there, grief and something else. Determination. "You're early," she said softly. "Your letter said a week." Vincent's jaw tightened. "I couldn't wait any longer, ma'am. I've been carrying this weight for 9 months. It's time you knew the truth about what happened to Thomas. All of it." Eleanor stepped aside. "Come in, Corporal. I just started reading his letters." Vincent entered the small living room, his eyes immediately finding Thomas's photograph on the mantel. He stood there for a long moment, just staring at his friend's face. "We called him Lucky," Vincent said quietly. Because no matter how bad things got, Thomas always found a way to keep us laughing. To keep us hoping. He turned to face Eleanor, and she could see tears welling in his eyes. But his luck ran out in Bastogne, Mrs. Hartwell. And it ran out because he gave it to me. Eleanor gestured to the couch. Sit down, Vincent. I'll make us some coffee. And then you're going to tell me everything. Narrator. As Eleanor disappeared into the kitchen, Vincent sat heavily on the couch, his eyes returning to the photograph on the mantel. In his mind, he was no longer in a quiet Pennsylvania living room. He was back in the frozen hell of Bastogne, where the snow ran red and heroes were made in the space between heartbeats. And Thomas Hartwell, Lucky Tommy, had been the greatest hero of them all. But the story Vincent had to tell wasn't just about heroism. It was about sacrifice, about secrets kept, and about a bond between soldiers that transcended death itself. The box had arrived. The letters were in Eleanor's hands. But the real truth, the truth that would change everything, was about to unfold. And in a small town in Pennsylvania, on a quiet September afternoon, a mother was about to discover that her son's death had saved not just one life, but dozens. And that the legacy he left behind would echo through the years in ways no one could have imagined. The coffee sat cooling on the table between them, untouched. Eleanor Hartwell sat in her late husband's chair, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes never leaving Vincent Castellano's face. The young corporal, he couldn't have been more than 25, looked like he'd aged a lifetime in the past year. Vincent held one of the letters from the box, turning it over in his hands like a sacred relic. Before I tell you what happened in Bastogne, Vincent began, his voice low and careful, you need to understand who your son was to us. To me. Eleanor nodded, unable to speak. Vincent set the letter down and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. After D-Day, Thomas and I were inseparable. We jumped into Holland together during Operation Market Garden. We fought through the Siegfried Line. Everywhere we went, he was the one who kept our spirits up. When we were pinned down outside Eindhoven, and Morrison, one of our guys, got hit, Thomas crawled 50 yards under machine gun fire to pull him back. Saved his life. That sounds like Tommy, Eleanor whispered, a sad smile touching her lips. He carried a picture of you, Vincent continued. In his helmet liner. Said it was his good luck charm. He'd show it to anyone who'd look, that's my ma, he'd say. Toughest woman in Pennsylvania. Raised me by herself after Dad died. If she could do that, I can do this. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. His father passed when Tommy was 12. Heart attack. He told me, Vincent said softly. Told me how you worked 2 jobs to keep the house, how you never missed one of his baseball games, how you taught him to be a man even though you were doing it alone. He paused, his voice cracking slightly. He was proud of you, Mrs. Hartwell. So damn proud. The September sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the worn carpet. Outside, children laughed as they played in the street, sounds of a world at peace, a world Thomas would never see. What happened in Bastogne? Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Vincent took a deep breath, as if preparing to dive underwater. His hands clenched into fists. Narrator. December 19, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and snow fell in thick, heavy curtains that turned the world into a frozen maze of white and gray. The German army had launched a massive counteroffensive, catching the Allied forces by surprise and surrounding the town of Bastogne. The 101st Airborne Division was dug in, outnumbered, low on ammunition, and completely cut off from reinforcements. They called it the Bulge, a desperate German push to split the Allied lines and reach Antwerp. For the soldiers in those frozen foxholes, it was simply hell. Vincent's voice pulled Eleanor back to the present, but his eyes were far away, seeing things she couldn't imagine. We'd been surrounded for 3 days, Vincent said, his voice taking on a distant quality, as if he were narrating someone else's nightmare. No supplies getting through. We were rationing ammunition, eating whatever we could scavenge. The cold was... God, Mrs. Hartwell, I can't describe the cold. Men were getting frostbite, losing toes and fingers. We'd huddled together in the foxholes just to stay alive. He stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to Eleanor. Thomas and I were in a forward position, about 200 yards from the German lines. There were 8 of us in that section: me, Thomas, a kid from Texas named Bobby Garrett, a sergeant from Ohio named Frank Kowalski, and 4 other guys. His voice dropped. On the morning of December 19th, the Germans launched an assault. Artillery first, they pounded us for an hour. Then the infantry came. Eleanor gripped the arms of her chair, her knuckles white. We held them off, Vincent continued. Barely. But during the fight, our position got overrun on the left flank. 3 of our guys were killed instantly. That left 5 of us: me, Thomas, Bobby, Frank, and a radioman named Eddie Chen. He turned back to face Eleanor, and she could see the weight of memory crushing down on him. We were trapped, Mrs. Hartwell. Germans in front, Germans behind. No way out. Eddie's radio was dead, took shrapnel during the shelling. We were on our own. Vincent walked back to the couch and sat down heavily. He picked up his coffee cup, looked at it, then set it back down without drinking. Thomas, he looked at us, all 4 of us, and he said something I'll never forget. He said, "Boys, I've been thinking. Today's not a good day to die. So here's what we're gonna do: we're gonna live." A ghost of a smile crossed Vincent's face. Bobby started laughing, this crazy, desperate laugh, and said, "Lucky Tommy's got a plan. We're saved." And Thomas grinned, even with bullets flying over our heads, and said, "Damn right I do." Eleanor leaned forward. What was his plan? There was a farmhouse about 300 yards to our east, Vincent said. Abandoned, but it had stone walls, good cover. Thomas figured if we could make it there, we could hold out until our lines advanced. The problem was getting there. Open ground. Deep snow. And a German machine gun nest with a clear line of sight to the whole approach. Vincent's hands were shaking now. He clasped them together to still them. Thomas said he'd draw their fire. Create a diversion while the rest of us made a run for it. I told him it was suicide. Frank told him. We all told him. But he just shook his head and said, "Vinny, remember that promise we made in Normandy? About looking after each other's families? Well, this is me making sure you're around to keep that promise." Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. I tried to stop him, Vincent said, his voice breaking. I grabbed his arm, told him we'd find another way. But he looked at me with those eyes, your eyes, Mrs. Hartwell, and he said, "You've got a girl waiting for you back in Brooklyn. Bobby's got a baby girl he hasn't even met yet. Eddie's got his whole family depending on him. Frank's got 3 kids. Me? I got my ma, and she's the strongest person I know. She'll be okay. She'll survive this. But those guys? They need to go home." Tears streamed down Vincent's face now, unchecked. Then he smiled at me. "God help me," he smiled, and said, "Besides, I'm lucky, Tommy, remember? Maybe my luck'll hold out." And before I could stop him, he was gone. Narrator. Private First Class Thomas Hartwell emerged from the foxhole into the blinding snow. His rifle was loaded with his last magazine, 30 rounds between him and eternity. The German machine gun nest was positioned on a small rise about 100 yards to the north. Thomas didn't hesitate. He ran toward them, firing as he went. The effect was immediate. The German gunners swiveled their weapon toward this lone, crazy American soldier charging through the snow. Tracers arced through the white sky, kicking up geysers of snow and ice around Thomas's feet. Behind him, Vincent, Bobby, Frank, and Eddie ran east, toward the farmhouse. They could hear Thomas's rifle barking, measured shots, precise even in chaos. He was giving them every second he had. Thomas made it 30 yards before the first bullet hit him. It spun him around, but he kept moving, kept firing. The Germans were fully focused on him now, pouring fire into his position. He made it 50 yards. 60. Impossibly, he was still on his feet, still fighting. In the farmhouse, the 4 survivors crashed through the door and immediately set up defensive positions at the windows. Vincent had his rifle trained on the German position, and what he saw through the scope would haunt him for the rest of his life. Thomas had gone down in the snow. But he wasn't dead. Not yet. He was crawling now, pulling himself forward with his elbows, still firing his rifle one-handed at the German position. Drawing fire. Buying time. The German machine gun was completely focused on finishing him off. They didn't see the American tank that had come around the southern ridge until it was too late. The Sherman's main gun spoke once, and the German position disappeared in a fireball of snow and debris. By the time Vincent and the others reached Thomas, the snow around him was red. Vincent's voice pulled Eleanor back to the living room. "We got to him maybe 2 minutes after he went down," Vincent said, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. The tank crew, they'd been probing the German lines, heard the firefight, came to investigate. They saved us. But Thomas. He couldn't continue for a moment. Eleanor waited, her own tears falling silently. "He was still alive when we reached him," Vincent finally said. "Barely. He'd been hit 4 times, chest, shoulder, leg, and, it was bad, Mrs. Hartwell. He knew he wasn't going to make it." Vincent reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. "He asked me to write something down." His hands weren't working anymore, but his mind was clear. "He dictated it to me, word for word. I wrote it in this notebook, and I've carried it every day since." He opened the notebook to a page marked with a faded ribbon and began to read. "Tell my ma I wasn't scared. Tell her I thought about her apple pie and her laugh and the way she used to sing while doing dishes. Tell her I'm proud to be her son. Tell her the last thing I thought about was her face, and I was smiling." Vincent's voice broke, but he forced himself to continue. "Tell her I saved my brothers today. Tell her it was worth it. Tell her not to be sad, I got to be a hero, and how many guys can say that? Tell her I love her. Tell her I'll see her again someday, in a better place than this. Tell her I'm finally warm." The notebook trembled in Vincent's hands. Those were his last words, Mrs. Hartwell. "Tell her I'm finally warm." Then he looked at all of us, me, Bobby, Frank, Eddie, and he smiled. Actually smiled. And then he was gone. The silence in the room was profound. Eleanor sat perfectly still, tears coursing down her face, but her expression was one of terrible, aching pride. "We buried him there," Vincent said softly. "In a field outside Bastogne." The chaplain said words over him. "We marked the grave with his rifle and helmet. And I made a promise standing over that grave, Mrs. Hartwell. I promised Tommy that I'd make it home. That I'd find you. That I'd tell you the truth." He looked up at her, his young face ravaged by grief and guilt. "I'm alive because your son died. Bobby's alive, he's back in Texas now, holding that baby girl. Frank's alive, back in Ohio with his 3 kids. Eddie's alive, working in his family's restaurant in San Francisco. For men, for families, all intact because of what Thomas did." Vincent stood and walked to the mantel, picking up Thomas's photograph. "The army listed him as MIA because the paperwork got screwed up in the chaos. Battle of the Bulge was a mess, units scattered, records lost. By the time they sorted it out, I was in a field hospital with pneumonia, then back on the line. It took me months to track down his official records, to get the story straight." He turned to Eleanor. "Your son wasn't just a hero, Mrs. Hartwell. He was the best of us. And I need you to know, I need the world to know what he did that day." Eleanor stood on shaky legs and walked to Vincent. She was a small woman, but in that moment, she seemed to fill the room with her presence. She took the photograph from his hands and looked at her son's face. "Thank you," she said simply. "For keeping your promise. For bringing him home to me, even if it's just in stories and letters." Vincent's face crumpled. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Hartwell. I should have stopped him. I should have." Eleanor reached up and placed her hand on his cheek, the way she used to do with Thomas. "You gave my son something precious," she said firmly. You gave him brothers. You gave him purpose. You gave him the chance to be the man I raised him to be. Don't you dare apologize for that. She pulled Vincent into an embrace, and the young soldier who'd survived frozen foxholes and artillery barrages and the death of his best friend finally broke down completely, sobbing into this stranger's shoulder like a child. You're home now, Eleanor whispered, patting his back. You're home, and you're safe, and Tommy would be so proud of you. They stood like that for a long time, two people bound together by love for a man who was gone but not forgotten. When Vincent finally pulled away, wiping his eyes, Eleanor walked back to the box on the table. She picked up the remaining letters. There are 6 more letters here, she said. Will you stay? Will you help me read them? I want to know everything about my son's last months. Every detail. Every story. Vincent nodded. Yes, ma'am. That's why I'm here. The letters tell the whole story, our time together, the battles we fought, the men we lost, the men we saved. Tommy wrote them knowing he might not make it home. He wanted you to understand what the war was really like. Not the propaganda version. The truth. Eleanor sat down with the letters, and Vincent sat beside her. As the afternoon sun tracked across the floor, they read together, Vincent filling in details, explaining references, bringing Thomas's words to life with his own memories. They read about the jump into Holland, about the house-to-house fighting in Eindhoven, about Christmas Eve in a bombed-out church where the men sang carols and pretended they weren't terrified. They read about the bonds between the soldiers, Bobby's terrible jokes, Frank's stories about his kids, Eddie's quiet competence with the radio, Morrison's recovery from his wounds. And they read about Vincent and Thomas, 2 kids from different worlds who'd found brotherhood in the worst circumstances imaginable. But there was one more letter, the 7th, that they hadn't reached yet. And as the sun began to set outside the window on Maple Street, Eleanor picked it up with trembling hands. This envelope was different. It was sealed with red wax, stamped with the insignia of the 101st Airborne. I haven't read this one, Vincent said quietly. Tommy gave it to me the night before the German offensive started. Said not to open it unless he didn't make it. Said to give it to you when the time was right. Eleanor looked at the seal, then at Vincent. Is the time right? Vincent met her eyes. Yes, ma'am. I think it is. Eleanor broke the seal and unfolded the letter. It was longer than the others, written in Thomas's careful hand. And as she began to read aloud, both she and Vincent discovered that Thomas Hartwell had one final secret to share, a secret that would change everything they thought they knew about his last days. Narrator. The letter began simply enough, but by the end, it would reveal a truth that Vincent Castellano had never known, a truth about sacrifice, about choice, and about what it truly means to be a hero. And in a quiet living room in Pennsylvania, as darkness fell outside and the first stars appeared in the September sky, a mother and a soldier would discover that Thomas Hartwell's story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The lamp on the side table cast a warm glow across the page as Eleanor Hartwell began to read her son's final letter aloud. Her voice was steady at first, strengthened by the hours she'd spent with Vincent, learning about Thomas's life as a soldier. But as the words unfolded, her voice would tremble, then break, then rise again with a mother's fierce pride. Vincent sat beside her, leaning forward, his entire body tense. He'd carried this sealed letter for 9 months, never knowing what was inside. Now, finally, Thomas would speak to them both one last time. Eleanor read. December 18, 1944. Somewhere outside Bastogne, Belgium. Dear Mom. If you're reading this, then I didn't make it home. I'm sorry for that. I know you've already lost Dad, and losing me too isn't fair. But life isn't fair, Mom. You taught me that when I was 12 years old, standing at Dad's grave. You told me that what matters isn't what happens to us, but what we choose to do about it. I'm writing this letter because I need to tell you something I haven't told anyone, not even Vinny. And I need you to understand why I'm about to do what I'm about to do. 3 days ago, on December 15th, something happened that changed everything for me. We were on patrol near a small village, I won't write the name because censors and all that. We came across a farmhouse that had been hit by artillery. The whole place was burning. We were about to move on when we heard crying, "A baby, Mom." A baby crying in that burning building. Vinny wanted to keep moving. So did Frank. It was too dangerous, they said. The Germans could be anywhere. We had to stay with our unit. But I couldn't do it, Mom. I couldn't leave that baby to die. So I went in. Vincent's head snapped up. What? Tommy, you never. He stopped himself, realizing he was talking to a memory. His hands gripped his knees. He never told me any of this. Eleanor continued reading, her voice soft. The smoke was thick. I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. But I followed the crying to an upstairs bedroom. And there she was, Mom. A little girl, maybe 2 years old, trapped under a fallen beam. Her mother was beside her, dead. Killed by the shrapnel that had torn through the roof. I pulled that beam off the little girl and carried her out of that house 30 seconds before the whole structure collapsed. She was screaming, terrified, didn't understand why this stranger in a uniform was grabbing her. But she was alive. There was an old woman hiding in the root cellar, the grandmother, I think. She came out when she heard the baby crying. The relief on her face when I handed her that little girl. Mom, I can't describe it. She kissed my hands, said things in French I didn't understand, but I didn't need to understand. I knew what she was saying. Thank you for saving my granddaughter. We stayed there for maybe 10 minutes. Just long enough to make sure they'd be okay, that they had food and water and a safe place to hide until the fighting moved on. The old woman wrote something on a piece of paper, an address in Paris. She pressed it into my hand, made me understand that I should come find them after the war. That I'd always have family in France. I don't know if I'll ever get to Paris, Mom. But I kept that piece of paper in my pocket. Just in case. Eleanor paused, her fingers trembling as she turned the page. Vincent was staring at the floor, his jaw clenched, processing this revelation about his best friend. When we got back to our lines that night, Eleanor continued, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that little girl. About how close she came to dying. About how one decision, my decision to go into that burning house, meant she got to live. And I realized something, Mom. Something important. We don't get to choose when we die. But sometimes, we get to choose what our death means. I've been watching the guys in my unit, Vinny, Bobby, Frank, Eddie, all of them. They have people waiting for them. Vinny has Rose, his sweetheart in Brooklyn. He carries her picture right next to his heart. Bobby became a father 2 weeks before we shipped out, he's never even held his daughter. Frank's got 3 kids who need their dad. Eddie's family lost everything when they were forced into those camps back home, he's all they have left. And me? I have you, Mom. And I know you. I know how strong you are. I know you survived losing Dad. I know you'll survive losing me, even though it'll hurt like hell. Vincent made a sound, half sob, half protest. Eleanor reached over and squeezed his hand before continuing. So I made a decision 3 days ago, standing outside that burning farmhouse. If it comes down to it, if there's ever a situation where someone has to make a sacrifice, I'm going to make sure it's me. Not Vinny. Not Bobby or Frank or Eddie. Me. Because here's what I figured out, Mom, that little girl in the farmhouse? She needed to live. Her grandmother needed her to live. And my brothers in this unit? They need to live too. The world needs them to live. I'm not saying I'm not important. I'm not saying my life doesn't matter. But if the math comes down to 1 life versus 4, or 1 life versus that little girl, or 1 life versus anything that means more lives get saved, well, that's not even a choice, is it? That's just math. You raised me to be a good man, Mom. To stand up for what's right. To protect people who can't protect themselves. And that's what I'm going to do, right up until the moment I can't anymore. I need you to know something else, though. This isn't about being sad or giving up. This is about being ready. Being willing. Being the person you taught me to be. When I was 8 years old, remember when I asked you what it meant to be brave? You told me that bravery isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and doing the right thing anyway. Well, Mom, I'm scared. I'm scared every single day. Scared of dying, scared of letting my brothers down, scared of never seeing your face again or tasting your cooking or walking down Maple Street on a Sunday afternoon. But I'm going to be brave anyway. The way you taught me. If you're reading this, it means my math came up. It means I had to make a choice, and I chose to save my brothers. Don't be angry at them for letting me. Don't be angry at me for doing it. Be proud, Mom. Be proud that your son knew what mattered and had the courage to act on it. Vinny's going to blame himself. I know him, he's going to carry this like it's his fault. When you meet him, and you will meet him because he's going to keep our promise, I need you to tell him something for me. It wasn't your choice, Vinny. It was mine. And I'd make it again. Every time. Tell Bobby to hold his daughter tight and tell her about Uncle Tommy who made sure her daddy came home. Tell Frank to hug his kids and maybe name one of the next ones Thomas if he has more. Or Eleanor, after you. That'd be nice. Tell Eddie that the best revenge against the people who hurt his family is to live a full, happy life. Tell him I said to open that restaurant he always talked about and make it the best damn place in San Francisco. And Vinny, tell Vinny to marry Rose. Tell him to have a dozen kids. Tell him to live twice as hard because he's living for both of us. Tell him that every good thing he does from now on, I'm doing it with him. Brothers forever, right? As for you, Mom, I don't know what to tell you except thank you. Thank you for every meal you cooked, every scraped knee you bandaged, every baseball game you cheered at, every night you tucked me in and told me you loved me. Thank you for making me into someone worth being. I don't know if there's a heaven, Mom. But if there is, I hope it has a kitchen where I can smell your apple pie baking. I hope it has a porch where I can sit and watch the sunset. And I hope it has a door, so that when your time comes, many, many years from now, I can open it and see your face again. Until then, I'll be watching over you. And I'll be watching over Vinny and Bobby and Frank and Eddie. Making sure they keep their promises. Making sure they live good lives. Don't cry too much for me, Mom. I got to be a hero. I got to save people. I got to matter. How many guys can say that? I love you more than words can say. You were the best mother a son could ask for. And wherever I end up, I'll be waiting for you with a smile and a hug and maybe, if I'm lucky, a slice of your apple pie. Your son, always and forever. Tommy. P.S. There's one more thing in the box. Under the fabric lining. Vinny doesn't know about it, and neither did anyone else. It's something I've been carrying since that day at the farmhouse. Make sure it gets to where it needs to go. You'll know what to do. Eleanor's hands shook as she finished reading. The room was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the soft sound of Vincent Castellano crying. He knew, Vincent finally said, his voice raw. He knew what he was going to do. He'd already decided. Eleanor carefully set the letter down and reached for the wooden box. She lifted the olive fabric that lined the bottom and there, tucked into a small space she hadn't noticed before, was a folded piece of paper yellowed and worn and a small photograph. She unfolded the paper first. An address in Paris, written in an elderly hand. Marie Dubois. 14 Rue de la Paix. Paris, France. The photograph showed Thomas in his uniform, kneeling in the snow, holding a small girl with dark curls. The girl was touching his face with one tiny hand, and Thomas was smiling, not the posed smile of the photograph on the mantel, but a genuine, joyful smile. Behind them stood an elderly woman, her face weathered but her eyes bright with gratitude. On the back of the photograph, written in Thomas's handwriting. Her name is Sophie. She's 2 years old. This is why. Eleanor pressed the photograph to her chest and closed her eyes. Her son hadn't just died saving 4 soldiers. He'd died saving them because he'd already saved a little girl and understood what it meant to choose life over death, even if it wasn't his own life. Mrs. Hartwell, Vincent said, standing up. His face was streaked with tears, but there was something else there now, determination. That address. We need to find them. We need to tell them what happened to Thomas. They deserve to know. Eleanor opened her eyes and looked at this young man, this stranger who'd become family in the space of an afternoon. Yes, she said firmly. Yes, we do. But not just them, Vincent. The world needs to know. My son's story, it can't end in a field in Belgium. It has to mean something more. Vincent nodded slowly. What are you thinking? Eleanor stood and walked to her writing desk in the corner. She pulled out paper and a pen. I'm thinking that you and I are going to write down everything, every detail, every story, every moment. We're going to document what Thomas did, what he meant to you and Bobby and Frank and Eddie. We're going to find that little girl in Paris and tell her that the soldier who saved her went on to save 4 more lives because of what he learned from saving hers. She turned to face Vincent, and in that moment, she looked exactly like the strong woman Thomas had described in his letters. My son said he got to be a hero. Well, I'm going to make damn sure the world knows it. Not for glory. Not for recognition. But because somewhere out there are other mothers whose sons didn't come home. And they need to know that their boys' deaths meant something. That their sacrifice wasn't wasted. Vincent's eyes widened as he understood what she was proposing. You want to tell all their stories? Yes, Eleanor said. All of them. Every soldier who gave his life so others could live. Every act of bravery, every moment of sacrifice. We're going to collect them all and make sure they're never forgotten. She walked back to Vincent and took his hands in hers. Will you help me? Will you help me make sure Tommy's death and the deaths of all the others like him, will you help me make sure they matter? Vincent Castellano, who'd survived Normandy and Holland and Bastogne, who'd watched his best friend die in the snow, who'd carried guilt and grief for 9 months, felt something shift inside his chest. Not healing, he knew he'd carry scars forever, but purpose. Direction. Yes, ma'am, he said, his voice strong. I'll help you. We all will, Bobby, Frank, Eddie. We'll tell every story we know. We'll track down every family. We'll make sure every hero gets remembered. Eleanor smiled, a sad smile, but genuine. Then let's get to work. Narrator. Over the next 6 months, Eleanor Hartwell and Vincent Castellano did exactly what they'd promised. They wrote letters to Bobby Garrett in Texas, Frank Kowalski in Ohio, Eddie Chen in San Francisco. They collected stories from dozens of soldiers who'd served with the 101st Airborne. They documented acts of heroism both large and small. Vincent used his connections in the army to track down families of fallen soldiers. Eleanor wrote to each one, asking permission to tell their son's stories. Almost all of them said yes. In March 1946, Vincent traveled to France. It took him 3 weeks, but he found 14 Rue de la Paix in Paris. He found Marie Dubois and her granddaughter Sophie, now 3 years old and thriving. When he showed them the photograph of Thomas, the old woman wept and kissed the image. Through a translator, she told Vincent that she prayed for Thomas every single day. That Sophie, who didn't remember the fire or the soldier who saved her, would grow up knowing the name of the American hero who gave her life. Vincent took dozens of photographs of Sophie and Marie. He brought them back to Eleanor, along with a letter from Marie written in halting English. Your son was an angel sent by God. Because of him, my Sophie lives. Because of him, our family continues. We will never forget Thomas Hartwell. Never. In June 1946, Eleanor and Vincent published a small book. They called it Letters from the Bulge, Stories of Sacrifice from America's Bravest. It contained Thomas's letters, stories from Vincent and the other survivors, and accounts from dozens of families whose sons had made the ultimate sacrifice. The book was only 100 pages long, printed by a small press in Philadelphia, with an initial run of just 500 copies. Eleanor and Vincent didn't expect much, they'd written it for the families, not for fame. But something remarkable happened. Newspapers picked up the story. Radio programs interviewed Eleanor and Vincent. Veterans groups invited them to speak. Within 6 months, Letters from the Bulge had sold 50,000 copies. Within a year, it was required reading in schools across Pennsylvania. The stories touched something deep in post-war America: a need to understand, to remember, to honor those who hadn't come home. Eleanor and Vincent traveled to towns and cities across the country, meeting families, collecting more stories, ensuring that no hero was forgotten. Bobby Garrett named his daughter Eleanor Marie after Tommy's mother and the grandmother in Paris. Frank Kowalski's fourth child was a boy, born in 1947, named Thomas Vincent. Eddie Chin opened his restaurant in San Francisco in 1948 and hung a photograph of Thomas in uniform behind the bar, with a plaque that read, "In memory of PFC Thomas Hartwell, who made sure his brothers came home." And Vincent Castellano? He married Rose in the spring of 1947. They had 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls. The oldest boy was named Thomas. Vincent went to college on the GI Bill and became a teacher. For 40 years, he taught history to high school students in Brooklyn, and on the first day of every school year, he told them about his friend Lucky Tommy Hartwell. He told them about a soldier who ran into a burning building to save a little girl. He told them about a soldier who charged a machine gun nest to save his brothers. He told them about a soldier who understood that heroism isn't about glory, it's about choosing to give rather than take, to save rather than be saved, to love rather than fear. Every December 19th, for the rest of his life, Vincent traveled to Pennsylvania. He and Eleanor would visit Thomas's grave. They'd finally brought him home in 1947, buried him in the cemetery beside his father. They'd place flowers and stand in silence, remembering. Sophie Dubois grew up in Paris, became a teacher like Vincent, and raised 4 children of her own. She never forgot the story her grandmother told her about the American soldier who saved her life. In 1968, she brought her own children to America, to a small town in Pennsylvania, to stand at Thomas Hartwell's grave and say thank you. Eleanor Hartwell lived to be 87 years old. She never remarried. She spent her years writing, speaking, and ensuring that the sacrifices of World War II were never forgotten. When she passed away in 1980, she was buried beside her son and her husband. Her gravestone bore a simple inscription: Eleanor Hartwell, 1893 to 1980. Mother of a hero. Keeper of stories. She made sure they mattered. Vincent Castellano died in 2001, at the age of 81, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. His last words, whispered to his oldest son Thomas, were, "Tell Lucky I kept my promise. Tell him we all did." Narrator. The wooden box that arrived on a September afternoon in 1945 didn't just contain letters and photographs. It contained truth. It contained love. It contained the unbreakable bonds between soldiers, between a mother and son, between people who understood that some things are worth dying for. Thomas Hartwell died at 23 years old in a frozen field in Belgium. But his story didn't end there. It lived on in the book his mother and friend published. It lived on in the children named after him. It lived on in the little girl in Paris who became a teacher and passed his story to hundreds of students. It lived on in Bobby Garrett, who became a minister and preached about sacrifice and love. It lived on in Frank Kowalski, who coached Little League for 30 years and taught boys about courage and brotherhood. It lived on in Eddie Chan, whose restaurant became a gathering place for veterans who needed to remember and be remembered. And it lived on in Vincent Castellano, who made sure that every single one of his students knew that heroes aren't born, they're made, one choice at a time. In 2004, the town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania erected a memorial in the town square. Bronze statues of 5 soldiers, Thomas, Vincent, Bobby, Frank, and Eddie, standing together, their arms around each other's shoulders, just like in the photograph from the wooden box. The plaque beneath reads, "In memory of PFC Thomas Lucky Hartwell, 101st Airborne Division, who taught us that true heroism is choosing to save others, even when it costs everything. December 19, 1944 inch." And below that, in smaller letters, "He saved his brothers. His brothers saved his story. His story saved his memory. His memory saves us all." Every year on December 19, the people of Millbrook gather at that memorial. Veterans attend. Families attend. Children attend. And they tell the story of Lucky Tommy Hartwell not as a tragedy, but as a triumph. Not as an ending, but as a beginning. Because that's what Thomas understood, standing in the snow outside Bastogne, making his choice. Heroes don't die when their hearts stop beating. They die when their stories stop being told. And as long as there are people willing to remember, willing to honor, willing to learn from the sacrifices made in frozen fields and burning buildings and 1,000 other places where ordinary people chose to be extraordinary. As long as there are people like that, heroes never really die at all. They just wait, patient and proud, for the next generation to carry their stories forward. And somewhere, in a place beyond cold and fear and war, Thomas Hartwell smiles, knowing that his mother got his letter. Knowing that Vincent kept his promise. Knowing that the little girl in Paris lived and thrived. Knowing that his death meant something. Knowing that he got to be a hero. And that, in the end, was all he'd ever wanted.